So Module 2 focuses on American transcendentalism, mostly the thought of Ralph Waldo Emerson, but others peripherally. We read Chapter 5 from American Philosophy called Transcendental Origins. We read Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay Nature that was reprinted in the anthology American Philosophies. We also read the introduction and Chapter 1 from Cornel West's book, The American Evasion of Philosophy. And I want to talk a bit about his introduction to that book because we'll be reading several other chapters from it and discuss the way that Cornel West sees Emerson as part of what he calls the prehistory of American pragmatism. And then finally, we read a chapter by Bruce Wilshire in his book, The Primal Roots of American Philosophy, that was on Black Elk, Thoreau, and Emerson. So Emerson, of course, is maybe the most famous American cultural critic, essayist, philosopher, and mystic. And the thing about Emerson's mysticism is that, he's really trying to philosophically transmute what might otherwise become a sort of religious enthusiasm. And he accomplishes this transmutation, by taking mysticism seriously, but by giving convincing expression, philosophical expression, to its meaning, right? So that the rare hours or moments when we find ourselves unexpectedly encompassed by visions of a higher reality, so that we can bring the meaning of these rare moments into common speech, but not losing sight all the while of their infinite mystery and their grand impersonality. I mean, Emerson is, if anything, a philosopher of the individual, championing the powers of the individual, both the religious, spiritual powers, as well as the cultural and political powers. But nonetheless, he wants the individual to acknowledge the impersonal one, the Platinian one with a capital O, that is at the base and source and fount of our souls, right? So the mystical feeling is not celebrated for its own sake by Emerson. Rather, he scours it. He scours this feeling for practical and intellectual gifts, for pragmatic payoffs that it might offer us in other less inspired hours, days, weeks, years, centuries, right? So he wants mysticism to become, and what the mystical feeling reveals, to become practically efficacious in the course of human history. So he's an idealist, he's a transcendentalist, and yet, as I think we'll see in his writings on nature and his understanding of American civilization, he was very much interested in the transformation of human life here on Earth, right? Not just in a sort of Neptunian mystical dissolution into the ether, right? He wanted to participate in earthly events. And yet, as especially Cornel West points out, there's some internal contradictions in Emerson's thought that potentially made his politics impotent, to use West's word. So Emerson lost many loved ones. His life was filled with tragedy, right? His father died just before he turned 9 years old, just before Emerson turned 9. Emerson lost 6 of his siblings to various ailments and illnesses before they reached 30 years old. His first wife, Ellen, died of tuberculosis just 2 years after their marriage, and they were deeply in love. And his first son, Waldo, died of scarlet fever at age 5. And that's not it. His best friend and most important influence, Henry David Thoreau, would die at 44, also of tuberculosis. So death was all around Emerson. But, though he loved deeply and loved and lost loved ones repeatedly from the moment that the philosophic itch first arose in Emerson's soul. His gaze was fixed securely on the problem of existence as such, right? Reality in general. So he suffered deep personal loss, but still his gaze was fixed on reality itself and the nature of human existence, right? Universally, rather than dwelling on his particular misfortunes, right? He was still able to access the divine ground of existence, and the mystical experiences of this ground that Emerson was privy to, he would say that they're not his own, as if they belong to him like his private property. Rather, Emerson would say that they revealed a perspective on things beyond the sentimentality of the merely personal, right? I quote Emerson from his essay, Intellect. "The considerations of time and place, of you and me, of profit and hurt, tyrannize over most men's minds. Intellect separates the fact considered from you." End quote. So, as you'll see, in that excerpt from his essay Intellect, and as you'll see in his essay Nature, there's a lot of, Emerson is claiming a privileged perspective, and indeed, as West will point out, it is a sort of racialized privilege, indeed a sort of white privilege. On page 46 of American Philosophies, in the excerpt of Nature, Emerson is talking about how the miracle of society, right? That he says, "The private poor man hath ships, cities, canals, bridges built for him. He goes to the post office, and the human race run on his errands. To the bookshop, and the human race read and write of all that happens for him. To the courthouse, and nations repair his wrongs. He sets his house upon the road, and the human race go forth every morning and shovel out the snow and cut a path for him." And it's like, well, yeah, for, the rising white middle class of 19th century, mid-19th century America, American civilization could very well appear in this way. But for an enslaved African or a Native American facing extermination, it is hardly the case, right, that the courthouse exists to repair his wrongs or her wrongs. And similarly for women, the human race does not run on her errands, right? She's the one running a lot of those errands. And so, there are moments in this essay where colonialism and white privilege, show their faces, and that shadow is evident. And at the same time, as West points out, there's a sort of, Emerson is both legitimizing and criticizing aspects of American civilization, American culture. And so he's both trying to take the side of the conquered, right, of the European, the people of European ancestry who colonized this land are, in large part, Emerson's people, right? The American people, the American civilization he is imagining is, in many ways, a continuation of the white project of colonial domination over the planet. And yet, Emerson was an outspoken critic of the American government's policy in regard to Native Americans. He spoke out publicly against President Van Buren at the time when the Indian Removal Act was passed and being enforced and enacted. He spoke out against slavery. He gave a speech with Lincoln in the audience during the Civil War prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. urging Lincoln to take that step, which Lincoln ended up doing several months later. So, Emerson was, he had dual allegiances, right? And we cannot simply flush him down the toilet or place his bust on the mantle. I think we need a more complicated relationship to him. The point is, I would argue that we need to inherit Emerson, and we need to inherit critiques of what he unwittingly legitimizes, and we also need to recognize the way that he does show some paths forward for America that are radically democratic, that do recognize the divine ground of nature and the divine ground of each individual, regardless of their station, the station they were born into in life. So there are ways to read Emerson against Emerson, right? And I think West does a good job doing that. So to just, lay my cards on the table, for me personally, Emerson's thought has been formative. I certainly have critiques of it. But as an American attempting to philosophize in the 21st century, I find it impossible to do without Emerson's transcendental spirit. I don't accept everything. I'm not an idealist, unlike Emerson. But, when I say we in this lecture, I am inviting us into a shared sense of responsibility to inherit Emerson. And now, if you don't share that sense, I also want to invite you, to be more critical and even dismissive, as long as you're able to, give fair arguments. I think that we need to put Emerson on trial to some extent, and as long as we make sure it's a fair trial, then we need to do it. The point is just that we need to inherit his thought, because he has left an indelible stamp on the American psyche, and he certainly, were he alive today, would have vastly more criticisms of the American mentality than he would praise for it. I don't know that he would have any praise for it at this point. But, so just to preface here, the invitation that I'm making, the multiple invitations really, to inherit Emerson either constructively, as I am trying to, or just purely critically. That's totally legitimate. So for Emerson, our world is overfull with fatalities, with fate, right? The greater part of the freedom that human beings are able to muster is found in, not our political action or our social mobility. I mean, our personal relationships even. Like we push for freedom to seize our capacity for agency, and to show up and be who we are and should be. But, for Emerson, fate is all. And the freedom that we are afforded is mostly in the realm of thought. And for Emerson, thinking means the freedom to ask our own questions, right? To pose our own problems, and not to be taken by the problems of others or of the mass, of society at large, right? He wants us to be able to invent, to have the courage to invent our own questions and to shape our lives around these questions. And so for him, this is our most serious task, right? To be philosophical, to lead a philosophical life, is to continually ask and ask again. So, Emerson says that the human being is endogenous because education is his unfolding. Right? This is in his essay, Uses of Great Men. The human is endogenous, right? The human grows from the inside out, and education is his unfolding. So, in this way, when we're children, we ask questions freely. And it's not until we enter school and are told by our teachers to respond to their problems, once we're told to respond to the problems imposed by standardized tests and the like, we have this innate capacity to ask our own questions sort of taken away from us. It's dulled at the very least. And so, in school, those who dutifully answer the questions posed by standardized tests, those who dutifully answer become the standard. They become the norm, right? And so Emerson's whole mode of philosophizing is a revolt against the standard, right? So he's saying, be one of those who refuses to have these problems imposed on you, and instead create your own educational process. Partake of genuine learning for yourself from the inside out, so that your soul grows like a plant, right? And Emerson was a deep appreciator and studied deeply Goethe's theory of plant morphology and morphogenesis, right? So, and Emerson applies this to his understanding of consciousness as like a plant that grows from the inside out. And for Emerson, the hardest task in the world, and yet also the place where we have the most freedom, is in our thinking, right? So it's the hardest task in the world to think, but it's also where our freedom begins. And we are seldom able to achieve even freedom of thought. It grows only with rare fits and starts in unexpected leaps. And often our own greatest thoughts do not even originate with us. They grow from the inside out, but they do so in a way that it's as if they're coursing through us, as if they're arriving from and departing to we know not where. So genuine thinking for Emerson hits us like a revelation, right? It leaves us always stupid with wonder, in his words. So thinking is always, and I quote Emerson again from his essay Intellect, thinking is always a miracle, which no frequency of occurrence or incessant study can ever familiarize. Right? Emerson continues, he says, thinking has a cosmic ground. It is, quote, the advent of truth into the world, a form of thought now for the first time bursting into the universe. And Emerson goes on, he says, I have observed persons who in their character and actions answer questions which I have not skill to put. And, Emerson, of course, was himself such a person. He poses questions that elevate my own understanding of what it's even possible to ask. And that is the task of the metaphysician, to make us aware of questions we did not even know needed to be asked. And, for Emerson, his ideal of the human as a thinking being was one that it was a base from which he criticized the state and the political norms of his society in the mid-19th century, right? So he says, quote, in the degenerate state, when the victim of society, the philosopher tends to become the parrot, the potential philosopher, we have to say, tends to become the parrot of other men's thinking. So, Emerson was involved politically in the great transformations, moral transformations of his age, right, including the Civil War and the Indian Removal Act, as I mentioned earlier, and he was on the right side of history in his public pronouncements. There's complications in his thought. Emerson has been described by some commentators, and West affirms this, as a typical 19th century North American liberal, moderate racist, in the sense that his sort of white supremacy was just a foregone conclusion, as it was for even many abolitionists, in the mid-19th century. So, again, complicated figure here, but if we read Emerson generously, I think there is much that remains edifying for our present day flailing democracy. We're striving for a kind of political system wherein all voices are heard, that is inclusive and pluralistic, and we're failing, right, miserably. And one of the things that Emerson probably would have counseled now is more self-cultivation. And he would say, I think, that we would need to create the conditions, the material, economic, and social conditions that made self-cultivation and a life of education, or paideia, possible. So Emerson would be an educational reformer today, just like he was in his own day, to make it possible for everyone, no matter the wealth of their family or the color of their skin, to access educational opportunities, real educational opportunities of self-cultivation, right? Not of, forced conformity to a standardized test. So, Emerson is counseling a kind of, calling us to a kind of sacred thinking. And this is why he says it's the hardest task in the world, because such thinking, it shares a common source with cosmogenesis, right? It is the creative power of the universe itself, risen to self-consciousness, right? This would be Emerson's view, kind of inheriting the nature philosophy of the German idealists, with an American individualist spin, right? So with such thinking, Emerson suggested, the mind transmutes life into truth. It distills the eternal idea from out of a flux of facts. And the difficulty of thinking creatively in this way results from the invisibility of this source, right? Even to a genius like Emerson. Emerson says, quote, "Man is a stream whose source is hidden." He says, "I am but a surprised spectator of this ethereal water." And it's from his essay, The Oversoul. So a genius, if we are to believe in the existence of geniuses, I think we have to say that they are people who don't become infected by other people's ideas. But they're also people who don't just make their ideas out of the power of their own will. There is a stream whose source is hidden, right, that flows through them. And it's more like the genius, in participating in this flow, is just becoming receptive to it. So rather than generating it through an act of their own personal will, it's more of an openness to a cosmic will that then flows through you. And Emerson, I think, rose to the level of this kind of creative thinking principally through his love of freedom, and not freedom in the shallower way that so many Americans presently understand it, right? As nothing more than like a childish cry, "Leave me alone," that kind of "don't tread on me" attitude that's really running rampant during this global pandemic. Not that cheap American freedom, but a deeper freedom that consists in an obedience to, the inner necessity of the soul, of conscience. So Emerson says, I quote, "To hazard the contradiction, freedom is necessary. If you please to plant yourself on the side of fate and say, fate is all, then we say, a part of fate is the freedom of humanity. So far as a human thinks, he or she is free." Right? So thinking is the hardest task in the world. And in most of our moods, we shrink before this task. We prefer the easier route to social acceptance that's granted us by mimicry, by going along with the crowd and saying what we're expected to say. And some people can put on a show of rebelliousness by railing against the values of their parents' generation. but they don't have the courage or the creativity or the commitment to replace those values with something more virtuous. Critique it's not easy, but it's easier than construction, than building something else to replace what's been deconstructed. And that's what Emerson was really calling us to do. He was critical. I mean, he was one of the he had one of the sharpest critical tongues when he aimed it at American culture. But today, with America facing really its greatest identity crisis since the Civil War, maybe even since the Revolutionary War, in this context, Emerson's sublime expressions, I hope, can still be audible to contemporary ears. And the people, let us call them Americans for now, right? And this whole notion of what an American is, I think, is something that I hope we can continue to contest throughout this course as we encounter new critiques of American civilization. Maybe we throw the term out. Maybe we don't want to be part of that people anymore. But maybe there is a new way of imagining the American people in such a way that we would want to belong to it. To continue the unfinished work of the Revolution and the Civil War and Reconstruction and the unfinished work of civil rights and on, and the environmental movement. It's all unfinished. Maybe being an American is to pick up that work and try to continue to execute it. So the people, if we want to call them Americans for now, to whom Emerson delivered his famous address in 1837 called The American Scholar. And incidentally, this is a speech that Oliver Wendell Holmes famously refers to as America's intellectual Declaration of Independence. But the people Emerson was speaking to had not yet lived through the horrors of the Civil War. It's 1837 when he gives this address. Even if they hadn't lived through the Civil War, the air was already tense in tragic anticipation of it. The late 1830s were marked by one of the worst recessions of the 19th century, and the need for the nation to finally face the ungodly institution of slavery was felt more strongly with each passing day. Contemporary America faces a similar set of existential challenges. I mentioned the pandemic earlier, continuing racism woven throughout so many of our institutions, consumer capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, which is kind of our undisputed civil religion, has made money into the holiest of sacraments, more valuable than equality and freedom, more valuable than culture and education, more valuable even than earthly life itself. And, polarized politics oriented toward the mob rather than to the mind continue to tear apart the social fabric. And, the ecological crisis, which is something Emerson and his fellow transcendentalists at the time in the mid-19th century, still in awe of the encompassing power of nature. The ecological crisis is just not something they could have foreseen. And it's worsening, and it's threatening to prematurely pull the plug on the entire venture of human civilization, much less American civilization. And so, while in 1844, a confident Emerson could write, I quote, "We think our civilization near its meridian, but we are yet only at the cock crowing and the morning star." So 170 plus years later, it's become clear that the industrial phase of civilization has irreversibly transformed the very geology of this planet and the climate of this planet. And today's, thinking people are having to take seriously the possibility, thinking and caring people we're having to take seriously the possibility that civilization, which seemed to Emerson a newborn Venus, now has more in common with hell-bound Lucifer, right? We're crashing and burning in so many ways right now. And if we are to hope for a new dawn of this country and of, the human presence on this planet, I think it might involve heeding some of what Emerson was calling for at the level of, our own interior individual development. But, as West makes so clear, it's not enough to just cultivate the inner depths of our own souls and to be self-reliant spiritually. Our individuality and our pursuit of this deep individuality, right, a connection to the eternal one within us that creatively repeats, to connect with the universal source of all things within the deepest recesses of our own individual heart. If this does not translate into socially transformative action, into community engagement, into political revolution, then it is functioning by default as an apology for the existing order. And so, Emerson has much to teach us, and it's not enough. But in an age like ours of, neuroscience and particle colliders and geoengineering, can we even still make sense of Emerson's core convictions that, within each human being is the soul of the whole, or that every natural process is a version of a moral sentence? Because if the latter is true, and, this is sort of the argument of nature, the essay that we read of Emerson's, that in every natural process is a version of a moral sentence. If this is true, then what sort of sentence is anthropogenic climate change pronouncing upon our civilization, right? Where is this soul in me and in you that Emerson claims can perceive the universe? Am I supposed to believe that the whole world can fit inside my skull? Because, in our neuroscientific materialistic age, we have to take it literally and think that somehow consciousness is just in our heads and all of Emerson's ideas are just, brain agitations. There really aren't many Americans prepared to heed the Emersonian response to such questions, right? We, Americans, are knowingly allowing ourselves and our planet to be destroyed due to the sheer weight of cultural habit, our lack of philosophical curiosity, our superficiality, which Emerson was already always complaining about in his own day. Our tendency to avoid thinking have allowed us to be lulled to sleep by the misenchanted materialistic mantras of industrial capitalism. I quote Emerson, writing in 1844, he says, "It is so wonderful to our neurologists that a man can see without his eyes, that it does not occur to them that it is just as wonderful that he should see with them." Right? What is Emerson saying there? He's saying that our consciousness is not confined to our skull or to our body. Our consciousness reaches out as far as our eyes can see to the horizon of the world itself, and there participates in bringing forth the phenomenon of nature. So what are we missing? What is Emerson imploring us to see? He doesn't offer any easy solutions to today's problems. Indeed, as West points out, in some ways, certain readings of Emerson could function to reproduce many of today's problems. But it is not simply that we must think harder or strive to be kinder to one another, right? In Emerson's words, just as we cannot make a planet with atmosphere, rivers, and forests by means of the best carpenters' or engineers' tools, with chemists' laboratory and smiths' forge to boot, right? We cannot make the earth technologically. We cannot remake it technologically, as the ecological catastrophe and climate change and mass extinction and on, is making clear to us. And in the same way, we cannot expect to construct, I quote Emerson, we cannot expect to construct a heavenly society out of foolish, sick, selfish men and women such as we know ourselves to be. So Emerson's not, pulling any punches here. He's being very honest about the state, the human condition. But he offers a means of dissolving poorly posed problems by calling us back before the posing to the uncanny ground of all our questioning. And that is to the feeling of wonder. Wonder allows us to stand in awe of the world again, right? To become mesmerized by the meeting place of green earth and blue sky. Wonder turns our attention away from the acquisition of things and toward their appreciation as such. Wonder leads us, in Emerson's terms, to make friends with matter, rather than always rushing to dominate it. Wonder is the most philosophical mood, because it is the strangest, the most thought-provoking and eye-opening. According to Emerson, quote, "The difference between the wise and the unwise is that the latter wonders at what is unusual, while the wise man or woman wonders at the usual." Natural science and industrial technology have progressed tremendously since Emerson's day, but despite, or perhaps because of their great successes, we have lost the ability to be amazed by the ordinary and to cherish what we could never acquire because it is already the very stuff of which we are made. If he saw the natural world as the soul's most ancient religion, we can be sure that Emerson would respond to today's ecological devastation with the same moral intensity that he felt regarding the abolition of slavery. And again here, as Wes points out, in his journals, Emerson reveals the moral struggle that he went through, that he felt like as much as he was devoted to the cause of abolition, he felt as though he didn't feel enough for it, that, the conveniences and comforts of his own life as a middle-class white intellectual made it was as if he was lamenting the fact that his social station in life made it hard for him to really feel every day the agony of the fact that millions of black men, women, and children were in slavery, right? So he spoke out against abolition, but he laments the fact in his private journals that he was not even more committed, not just in thought and writing and speech, but in bodily action to the cause of abolition. But, were he alive today, I think a generous reading of his life and works would force us to admit that Emerson he'd reaffirm his criticism of American culture's bad name for superficialness. We remain today a people concerned more with the economic bottom line than with the higher truths of philosophy. With what is convenient, we're more concerned with what is convenient and profitable today rather than what holds for all time. But Emerson did not speak to us as Americans only. He spoke to us as individuals and to the highest part of our individuality. His essays are addressed not to nations or to creedal sects, but to those singular, self-reliant human beings who refuse to be counted as members of any mass, to those for whom society and its party and institutional allegiances are but oppressive abstractions. We don't want to go too far with that, but there's something powerful in it, to not get lost in the mass, right? He spoke to those who, I quote, can open their eyes wider than to a nationality, namely to considerations of benefit to the human race and in the interest of civilization itself. So on January 31st, 1862, 9 months after the first shots of the Civil War were fired, Emerson delivered a speech at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., urging the immediate emancipation of the slaves, both for strategic and, more importantly, for moral reasons. The speech was entitled American Civilization, and Lincoln was in the audience, and Emerson's speech won him an audience with the president the following day. It would be another 9 months before Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and 2.5 years later, Lincoln would be assassinated. Emerson was invited to give Lincoln's eulogy and described Lincoln in his eulogy as, quote, an entirely public man, father of his country, the pulse of 20 millions throbbing in his heart, the thought of their minds articulated by his tongue. But unlike Lincoln, the statesman, again, a complicated man, Emerson was not by nature a political person. He was a scholar. He was a philosopher. He was, or strove to be, a thinking person, which is a very inward, private activity. And, he was himself a passionate reformer, despite being, at the same time, suspicious of other reformers and their movements. Having personally witnessed the largely failed attempts at socialist revolution in London and Paris during his trip to Europe in 1848, Emerson wrote in his journal that, I quote, "It is always becoming evident that the permanent good is for the soul only and cannot be retained in any society or system. So it is not a more perfect state that will solve the world's political problems, according to Emerson. Instead, what's going to solve these political problems, he thinks, is wiser individuals." So in his 1844 essay on politics, Emerson wrote, I quote, "To educate the wise human, the state exists for that purpose. And with the appearance of the wise human, the state expires. The appearance of character, right, of wisdom in personality makes the state unnecessary." And this is Emerson's, typically romantic view of the relationship between the individual and the state and the social contract. It is utopian. He's not alone among, European philosophers in imagining that, with the appearance of the wise human being, the state becomes unnecessary. Whether or not that is a realistic vision to uphold, I think remains to be seen. It's certainly something worthy of our attention and dialogue. As fate would have it, Emerson found his fame and influence as a thinker rising just as his young nation began falling into its first major crisis since the Revolutionary War. The weight of the times forced Emerson to find his political voice. In 1838, Emerson published an open letter to President Van Buren, as I mentioned earlier, repudiating his administration's plan to forcibly remove the Cherokee Nation from its land. In this respectful but forthright letter, Emerson demanded to know, quote, "whether all the attributes of reason, of civility, of justice, and even of mercy shall be put off by the American people. Will the American government steal? Will it lie? Will it kill?" These are Emerson's words from his letter to the president. And several years later, in 1844, he roused Concord's abolitionists by delivering a passionate speech denouncing the evils of slavery, with the same metaphysical confidence that would lead Martin Luther King Jr., a similar confidence, I should say, that would lead MLK to announce and evince the inevitable bending of the moral arc of the universe toward justice. Emerson declared, to those unable to heed the cosmic call for freedom, he said, quote, "Creep into your grave. The universe has no need of you." In 1851, After the passage of the infamous fugitive slave law, several dozen citizens of Concord signed a petition urging Emerson to publicly speak out against it. He did. I quote, "America, the most prosperous country in the universe, has the greatest calamity in the universe, Negro slavery. The existence of slavery," continued Emerson, "turns into hollow American brag the notion that his countrymen loved freedom and believed in the Christian religion. Hollow American brag in light of the institution of slavery." By the time of his speech at the Smithsonian in 1862, which was perhaps both the climax of his political activity as well as the darkest period of the war, Emerson's national stature was well established. He was 60 years old. He was already considered America's philosopher. Standing on the speaker's platform of the Smithsonian Lecture Hall, Emerson denounced the conspiracy of slavery. I quote, "They call it, the South, an institution. I call it a destitution. We live in a new and exceptional age," he continued. "America is another word for opportunity. Our whole history appears like a last effort of the divine providence on behalf of the human race." Emerson's popularity surged during the war. One gets the impression, as his biographer Robert Richardson says, that by the height of his fame, there were two Emersons. There was the private mind, which was increasingly being outpaced by the public image, which preceded it. According to Richardson, by 1863, Emerson had become an inescapable part, a fixture of American public life. In 1865, he would deliver an astonishing 75 lectures, including Lincoln's eulogy. In 1867, he lectured for 80 audiences in 14 states. A morally wounded post-Civil War America lionized Emerson as its national hero. He strengthened the souls of his fellow citizens by reminding them of the idealism the country had been founded upon. In the years following the war, in Richardson's words, the public Emerson seemed more and more to be replacing the private one. Emerson, reconciling the opposites within himself, or attempting to, would write in 1871 that the most private self-searcher will be the most public and universal philosopher, if his study is real. The Emerson scholar Richard Geldard begins his timely book, Emerson and the Dream of America, by reminding his readers that Emerson was intelligent enough to know that the times seem perennially bad, especially as seen through the light-infused prism of an irrepressible idealism. As Emerson himself put it, the times are the masquerade of the eternities, trivial to the dull, tokens of noble and majestic agents to the wise. So it is no surprise that our time appears to almost everyone alive, whether liberal or conservative, revolutionary or reactionary, religious or secular, young or old, our times appear to be deeply troubled, even catastrophic. The times are perennially bad. Emerson's essay Self-Reliance, perhaps one of his most famous, has long been praised by Americans for its defense of individuality. And we should be careful, though, as I've mentioned earlier, not to oversimplify Emerson's message. Individualist though he may have been, he had as much distaste for wanton capitalism, which he called a system of selfishness, as he did for big government. His emphasis on self-reliance needs to be clearly distinguished from selfishness. Emerson's his individuality is not so superficial as to amount to a sort of ethical egoism. On the contrary, Emerson implores his readers to awaken from their mistaken identities, to get their selfish little egos out of the way, so that a higher universal self, owned by no one in particular, might pour its light into the soul. I quote Emerson, "When we discern justice, when we discern truth, we do nothing of ourselves, but allow a passage to its beams." That's from the essay Self-Reliance. So if the American experiment really is the last effort of the divine providence on behalf of the human race, then we have precious little time remaining to make good on our promise. And to say this, that the American experiment might be the last effort of the divine providence on behalf of humanity, I mean, what is meant by this statement? There was an attempt, at least as an ideal, there was an attempt in the founding of this country to give rise to a pluralist democracy where individual freedom and social justice could be realized. And the revolution itself, with the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the process of trying to frame a set of political procedures and institutions so as to provide for and protect individual freedom and social justice. The fight to abolish slavery and racism and sexism and other forms of exclusion. That is an ongoing project. But if this country cannot succeed at pluralistic democracy, if the experiment fails, where else on earth could it be taken up? So there's something, I think, important, a unique karma or destiny that the United States of America, whether it continues to take that political form or some new form in the future that carries forward and inherits, all the things that we're studying in this course this semester, whatever the political form takes, an experiment has been undertaken on this continent, and then if it fails, if it becomes fascist, or if it just falls apart and balkanizes, then where on earth will the experiment be conducted next, right? So if the gravity of our time is not sufficient enough to do so from the outside, then it is to the inner light of the soul that Emerson calls us to turn our attention, to awaken us from this nightmare. No crusades against evildoers, nor simply new policies or legal measures alone can save us now. At least this is the Emersonian perspective, right? New policies, new legislation treat symptoms, right? They leave the cause, they leave the wound itself untouched. So what are we to do? Well, despite the risk of sounding sentimental, I want to draw this essay to a close by offering Emerson's Answer, which he repeated again and again in so many of his lectures and essays. We are to love one another. Love as a relational ethos of, a relational ethos that recognizes the way that individuality is constructed communally, in deep relationship with one another, through networks of mutual aid as we lift one another up. And so we are to love one another is a very serious answer that real social reforms follow from it. And yes, perhaps new legislation and political movements, but it begins with the genuine openness to the power of love. Because it turns out, if Emerson is right, and if a much more ancient tradition is right, love is more powerful than force. And so Emerson says, I quote, "We must be lovers, and at once the impossible becomes possible. Let our affection flow out to our fellows. It would operate in a day, the greatest of all revolutions. So all our social ills, according to Emerson, stem from our failure to love, even the most religious among us. Lack of basic faith in the moral potential of human beings, from Emerson's point of view. We find ourselves unable to muster, quote, a sufficient belief in the unity of things to persuade us that society can be maintained without artificial restraints as well as the solar system. To succeed in loving is perhaps no less difficult than to succeed at thinking. Though a few shining exemplars of unconditional love, like Buddha and Jesus, and a few shining exemplars of transcendental thinking, like Emerson, though they assure humanity of the potential to realize these ideals, neither love nor thinking can be taught to us by others. Both depend upon the cultivation of self-knowledge. Loving and thinking are held far apart by our modern notions of academic knowledge, but for the philosopher, for the Emersonian philosopher, the lover of wisdom, they are and can never be two. I just want to briefly touch on the way that in American philosophy, Pratt and McKenna link the collective action work of activists like Charlotte Perkins Gilman and Julia Howe Ward and Josephine Shaw Lowell. They link it to an important transformation of the philosophy of transcendentalism of Emerson and Thoreau. They were able to prevent it from just becoming about this sort of interior work of soul cultivation, which would be, in a way, pathologically individualist rather than, I think, the more socially potent form of self-cultivation that Emerson intended. But there's a way in which, as West points out, Emerson can, his ideas, shallowly understood, can function as apology for or even to reproduce some of the baser elements of human, of American culture. They can function to support racism and capitalism and so on. So I also wanted to briefly touch on what Cornel West says in the introduction to his book, The American Invasion of Philosophy, where he reads pragmatism as a form of radical democratic thinking that is a challenge to, classical liberalism. There's a different conception of the individual and of society and of the relative of the relationship between, the ideal relationship between society and the market and the state. West, I think, is introducing pragmatism as not just a philosophical school of thought, but as a form of, prototypic, not prototypically, but prototypically American cultural critique and provocation. So that what is unique about American philosophy, if it has something unique that makes it stand in contrast to European philosophy, it is that it is practically engaged with the everyday life of the citizens of this country. That's the ideal. It's radically democratic in that sense. It's not trying to impose abstract ideas upon, the common sense perceptions and everyday activities of the people, right? This is what pragmatism strives to be, at least, right? And West points out how the pragmatic tradition began with it arises out of a disenchantment with, the sort of European idealisms coming out of Germany and France to some extent that were more epistemology-centered, right? It was philosophy framed as a tribunal of reason, rather than a philosophy like pragmatism, which is framed as an engagement with reality, practical engagement with reality, where it's less important that an idea be true a priori than that it be that its consequences, the consequences of holding that idea, are fruitful. That becomes the measure of truth in pragmatism. It's a crude formulation there, but that's basically right. West will point out the way that pragmatists pay close attention to the materiality of language, to the socio-historical constructions of things like race and gender. For the pragmatist, West says, agency is the primal stuff of human history. And he points out that pragmatism, like Emerson, has these two sides, right? On the one hand, profound insight. On the other hand, myopic blindness. And he thinks, these two sides of pragmatism results from the ambiguities of American civilization itself, right? On the one hand, founded under the ideal of revolutionary freedom, at the same time that there is a slave-based economy that's not even mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. And more than anything else, West is trying to lift up pragmatism as an indigenous mode of thought that subordinates knowledge to power, that subordinates tradition to invention, that subordinates instruction to provocation, and that subordinates community to personality. And it subordinates immediate problems to utopian possibilities. And for West, philosophy is, pragmatic philosophy is about cultural criticism. It's an attempt to explain America to itself at a particular historical moment. And so, the pragmatist project must be renewed in each historical period by the philosophers of that age to explain America to itself in that time and place. West writes that philosophy must administer to a confused populace caught in the whirlwinds of societal crisis, the crossfires of ideological polemics, and the storms of class, racial, and gender dynamics, right? So West wants to engage philosophy as an organic intellectual. This is his phrase for it. And an organic intellectual is a participant in the life of the mind who revels in ideas, but also seeks to connect them to action by consolidating constituencies, for moral aims and political purposes. This is the role of the organic intellectual for West. He calls his, in the way that he inherits pragmatism as a prophetic pragmatism. And it's a response, he says, to the concrete nihilism in working and underclass American communities. He's trying to empower novel forms of indigenous American oppositional thought and action. And so West will be with us throughout this course. We'll be reading chapters from his book, The American Evasion of Philosophy, as we move forward. And I really invite you to, just consider and be open to the way that he's articulating this American style of philosophizing, that he says it swerves from the habits of European thought. I think there is something edifying in it. And, Cornel West remains quite active politically today, bringing a, heartfelt and profound sense of the power of the philosophical life to be transformative of our society, of our democracy, and to restore our democracy, in fact, that we, in a way, the American amendment to Plato's understanding of the ideal city would be that in like someone like Cornel West's ideal American civilization, we would each be afforded the opportunity to become philosopher civilians, not philosopher kings, an elite few who rule over society from above based on noble lies, but rather a democratic form of philosophical society that engages in paideia and education and learning as an end in itself and as the highest pursuit that a society, a civilization could engage in, rather than just the making of money and the wielding of power over others. The cultivation of the life of the mind and the expressions of the heart. This is, I think it's what's at the heart of Emerson's idealism, and it's what's at the heart of Cornel West's prophetic pragmatism as well.